because I was a philosopher and very critical, sort of skeptical, I was agnostic. That's what I would call myself. I wouldn't call myself Hindu. For my entire upbringing, I would not. I would say I was a spiritual seeker who had not yet decided on his or her particular path in philosophy. And one of the most common mistakes I find people make is to equate Vedanta with Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's a serious mistake. So with regard to the sort of conflicting traditional Vedantic schools, I think what Sri Ramakrishna does is harmonizes them on the basis of his own spiritual experiences. Sri Ramakrishna actually practiced Christianity, he practiced Islam, and he found that they also are effective paths to the goal of God realization. And he realized through these paths, God in the form of Christ and God in the form of Allah. Ultimately, one should strive to combine the yogas to the best of one's ability, because each of them taps into a different aspect of the human personality. And so the most potent practice is one that combines the kind of forces of these different spiritual practices. Right before and right after, and sometimes in the midst of the work that I'm doing, whether it's writing an article or a book, I offer what I've done to God.
It's great to speak to you after such a long time, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Keshav.
Yeah, why don't we start with where we usually start? Again, the whole point is just to ask you that one question. What is your philosophy of now? But we believe that in order to get to that, we kind of need to learn a lot more from you. And so I guess to start off, what was your initial exposure to spirituality as a whole? When were you hooked? When did it occur to you to take this as a path?
Yeah, I think I'd say when I was around 19, I can't remember the exact age, but when I was fairly young, late teens, I think, I read the Bhagavad Gita for the first time. And I didn't learn Sanskrit until later. I learned Sanskrit as a PhD student, but this was before that. And so I remember Sri Aurobindo's translation and commentary on the Bhagavad Gita. And that I found immediately inspiring. It was like something clicked in me, because before that, I was sort of like nominally Hindu in the sense of being born into a Hindu family, but I never really identified as Hindu because nobody explained to me the underlying spiritual principles of my religion. My parents would take me to puja. I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with this because you grew up in in New Jersey. Is that where you grew up?
Yeah. Yep.
Yes, I grew up in Boston, and I would just go to pujas a couple times a year, and I would have almost zero interest in it. It seemed like idol worship and superstition. Nobody explained to me what the deeper spiritual ideas behind these rituals were. So I would end up playing American football outside with my friends instead, and just going in for the food, for khichdi, and then coming out again. And so, yeah, it was my encounter with the Gita that first introduced me to the spiritual core of Hinduism. That's what I'd say. And that's really when I say something clicked, I think I had monastic samskaras, latent mental impressions, probably from a previous birth, but that they weren't triggered until I'd read the Bhagavad Gita, I would say.
When did you read that? When was that?
I mean, 19 or 20.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And where was that, I guess? Where did you come across it? Like, was it at home? Was it, or somewhere you went?
I ordered a copy of the book. Because I'm not. Yeah, I was actually actively searching. I was a kind of active spiritual seeker, and reading different religious scriptures, reading the Bible, debating with a Christian friend of mine. I remember I spent a year at Oxford during my junior year as an undergraduate.
Right.
I remember having really intense conversations with him about Christianity, and so it's in that context of searching that I also felt the desire to read the Bhagavad Gita. And I was open. I mean, I didn't, because I was a philosopher and very critical, sort of skeptical. I was agnostic. That's what I would call myself. I wouldn't call myself Hindu. For my
Yeah.
entire upbringing, I would not. I would say I was a spiritual seeker who had not yet decided on his or her particular path and philosophy. That came
Yeah.
later.
Can you like maybe go into like your mindset then a little more? I know I remember when we first spoke when we met in Belur, when I was there, or we talked about, or you talked about, um, your even when you came into Belur, and correct me if I'm wrong because it's been quite a few years, um, you approached it in a very open-minded lens, right? You were very open to, you know, you were a seeker, like you said, but you were open to not, finding your own path in a sense. Um, so how was your mindset like during those, years of, seeking and active seeking, to find that path? What was it like? What did you explore?
Yeah, I mean, I was going back to that time in my life. I was a student of philosophy, and I was a kind of budding philosopher, and so it was sort of at once exciting and sort of uncomfortable, maybe at the same time, because I hadn't yet found it, discovered my like a secure foundation for living. Um, yeah, so it's hard to kind of transport myself back into that time, but yeah, I just remember getting lots of debates, reading very, very widely. I was reading Dhammapada from Buddhism, parts of the Quran, Bible, of course, and Bhagavad Gita and other texts, and just trying to like. I kept telling myself, if religion is true, then it's extremely important, and it has to be kind of decisive in life. And if it's not true, um, then boy, life is pretty bleak. And I was kind of like vacillating between these kind of extremes. This is actually something that I discovered Vivekananda had said later. Swami Vivekananda, he had said, I'm just paraphrasing, but he said something like, um, "If God is true, what else in life matters? If God is not true, what do our lives matter?"
Wow.
And so I was deeply interested in existentialism, existentialist philosophy, Albert Camus, and also Jean-Paul Sartre, Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard, of course, was a kind of religious Christian existentialist, so it's a little bit different. Um, but also, especially for the beginning of my graduate career, I discovered art films, and I loved Ingmar Bergman and Bela Tarr is my favorite contemporary filmmaker. I think he stopped making films after his last one, The Turin Horse. But it's like very sort of dark and somber and kind of. So I was like, one part of me was like dwelling in this bleak existentialist nihilistic universe, and the other side of
Right.
it was more hopeful and kind of searching for an alternative. But I wouldn't rest with. I was also like too convinced by Marx and Freud that religion is also a kind of opiate for the masses, or that it could be, and that it's very easy to kind of lull yourself into religious belief, because it's nice to believe in religion, but not because it's true. And so and as a philosopher, I needed good reasons to accept a particular religion. And then there's this added question: even if religion is true, which religion is true? Because there are so many out there, often conflicting on different points of doctrine. And that's why I found no reason to favor Hinduism just because I was born into it. I've never believed that, and I still don't believe it. Now, of course, I mean, now I accept, because I'm a Hindu, I accept the doctrines of karma and rebirth, and so there's a karmic reason why I was born into a Hindu family, probably, and why I'm Indian. But that by itself still doesn't, guarantee that one should become a Hindu. I don't believe that. Again, that's something that Swami Vivekananda that really resonated with me when I read the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, because in one place he says, "No person is born into a religion. Each person has a religion in the depths of his or her soul." And so one might say that at that time in my life, I was kind of trying to discover what that religion in the depths of my soul really was.
Interesting. Um, I think in a way, it's what's also fascinating is there's sparks of this. I think you definitely had it, from what I hear and it's such that seeking was so much more intense, right? Being a
Mhm.
philosopher, and looking for um, you were looking for truth, right? A seeker of truth. And but you see sparks of that, especially in any youth, and especially,
Yeah.
being in America, being someone who does come from, you know, it could be a Hindu background, but in an immigrant background, right?
Mhm.
Where it's like, here's the culture that I was raised in, but I'm not gonna embrace it until I've explored what's right for me,
Right.
right? And from what it sounds like, it's like you had to find that on your own. You had to prove it to yourself, before you jumped on that. And I guess my question is, how did you prove it to yourself, or like when did you prove to yourself that, hey, this is, if you want to call it Hinduism or whatever, we could get
Mhm.
to that question later. But when did you think this Vedantic way of thinking, was for me? That what was it that convinced you?
Sure. Yeah. I would say what happened was when I started grad school, I still hadn't known anything about the life or teachings of Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Vivekananda. Um, but by a series of coincidences, it turned out that one of my, we can call him an uncle. I mean, he's sort of a cousin. I'm not even sure if he was exactly related, but he was a close family friend. He passed away, and my parents inherited some of his books, or maybe all of his books. I don't remember. And my parents were living in Calabasas in Southern California at the time, here in Southern California. And I was in Berkeley doing my PhD. But I would come to visit them once in a while, for vacation or whatever. And I, I remember that next to the bed that I was sleeping on, there was a bookshelf. And on the bookshelf were some of the books that my parents had inherited from him. And one of them was the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in Nikhilanandaji's translation. Another one was Nikhilanandaji's biography of Swami Vivekananda. And I just remember devouring the biography of Vivekananda. I found it so compelling. It's a wonderful biography. There are multiple biographies of Swami Vivekananda. By far, my favorite is Swami Nikhilanandaji's Swami Vivekananda, a biography. It's really wonderful. I recommend it to everybody. Um, so after that, I'm having some difficulty remembering the exact sequence of. But at another point, and it actually might even be before this, but I think it was after this. My uncle is a devotee of Sri Aurobindo, and I was visiting him in Pondicherry, where the Aurobindo ashram is. And we were in the Vak bookstore, which is the ashrama's bookstore, which sells lots of different spiritual books. And he's known me for my entire life. And so he, sort of knowing my temperament, he bought two books for me, gifted them to me. One was Ramana Maharshi's Erase the Ego, a compilation of his teachings, and little booklets. And the second was Swami Vivekananda's Raja Yoga. And I read both and loved them both, but was especially drawn toward Swami Vivekananda, and then felt that I had to order the entire complete works. So when I was in Berkeley, I ordered the whole 9 volume complete works from Kolkata, Advaita Ashrama, and I remember that the price of the books was less than the shipping costs because Indian books are so cheap. So I got those, and then I went through the whole 9 volumes in a very short period of time. I don't remember exactly how long, but while I was doing my PhD, and that really was transformative. I would say. I just To me, Vedanta is so rationally satisfying, um, and also so broad and liberal and accommodative. And these are the two things that I was, and it answered the questions that the kind of burning questions that I had for years before that. One of them was, even if religion is true, which religion is true? And the Vedantic answer from Vivekananda's Vedantic standpoint is multiple religions can be equally effective paths to the same goal, even if they differ on points of doctrine, and even if one religion might be right about a particular thing, another religion might be wrong. I mean, to give you an example, this is something I often discuss in my scholarly work. Did Christ die on the cross? Christians say yes. That's a crucial. That's obviously a fundamental dogma to them. And Muslims say no. Many people aren't aware that in Islam, it's denied that Christ died on the cross. So and there are many other examples of this. What about rebirth? Is there rebirth? Abrahamic religions say no, Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism say yes, so on and so forth. But what Swami Vivekananda helped me to see, what Sri Ramakrishna helped me to see, is that even if there are facts of the matter about these kinds of doctrines, even if religion gets something wrong, even if the Abrahamic religions are wrong about rebirth, say, maybe there is rebirth, that doesn't handicap that religion from the standpoint of serving as an effective path to salvation. And so that's just one example of the many different ways in which I felt that Vedanta was rationally satisfying and compelling, and sufficiently broad and accommodative.
When it comes to being an agnostic, I mean, during that, that point, um, let's go into that a little bit. What do you define as being an agnostic?
Um, I would define it as just not knowing whether God exists.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that's like an important path, or not important path, but an important stage in a seeker's journey? Like, is it important to find a rational foundation to whatever path you choose? And in order to get to that, you have to start with a form of being an agnostic. Do you believe, like, is that a step? Do you believe?
It's a step for some spiritual aspirants and not for others. That's what I would
Okay.
say. And for Swami Vivekananda, it was a very, very important step. But more interestingly, even for Sri Ramakrishna, there was a period before he had God realization for the first time when he was doubting. I don't know how familiar you are with the life of Sri Ramakrishna, but when he's intensely praying and engaging in intense spiritual practice and worshiping Kali, praying to Mother Kali, at one point he gets so desperate, he says, in a panic almost, he's like, are you just an image of clay? Or are you divine consciousness? That to me is that's a doubt. That's a kind of agnosticism that, I mean, in him, it was so ratcheted up that he was ready to kill himself. He was ready to slit his own throat because he hadn't realized God after so much struggle. And then, of course, happy ending, Divine Mother then grants him her vision and much more than that. And so he doesn't kill himself. But Swami Vivekananda is an interesting case, and that it's very it resonates a lot with me, because he was an undergraduate student of philosophy at Scottish Church College in Kolkata. He read all the major Western philosophers, John Stuart Mill and Kant and Hume, and he was immersed in that line of thinking. He was convinced at one point of Mill's argument against God's existence, based on the problem of evil, because Mill found it impossible to reconcile God's goodness and omnipotence with the presence of so much evil in the world. And so, as far as I remember, Mill actually he opts for sort of curtailing God's omnipotence as the only way to solve this problem. So then we can't accept the traditional theistic God. We have to kind of scale back his omnipotence in order to explain why a perfectly loving God would still allow so much evil in the world. And so Vivekananda was convinced by these kinds of arguments, or at least found them things that are worthy to think about, and would be challenging Sri Ramakrishna as well. He didn't just immediately accept whatever Sri Ramakrishna said. He tested everything he said, and so that really, I mean, it was those aspects of Swami Vivekananda's life and his early encounter with Sri Ramakrishna and with Western philosophical thinking that resonated so deeply with me.
Yeah. No, that's amazing. I was, speaking of Sri Ramakrishna, I think it's a good time to really talk about him. I know that's a really it's a very difficult topic to talk about because you could go in so many directions with,
Mm.
um, you know, who he is and how he was and how he is. Um, you know, what this is a difficult question, but what stood out to you first about Sri Ramakrishna? Like, what attracted you first in your understanding of him? Because, like you said, and from what I gather as well, it's Vivekananda's journey, Vivekananda's rationale was it was kind of in line with you. You were able to
Mm-hmm.
follow that.
Mm-hmm.
um Sri Ramakrishna is someone he's a devotee. He's in many
Mm-hmm.
senses he's someone who, from the outside, one who may not understand him, seems like someone who might be a little crazy, if you're just looking at him from the outside and not actually understanding him, spending time understanding him. How did you come to understand, and how did you build a relationship with Sri Ramakrishna?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I was not initially drawn toward the bhakti aspects of Sri Ramakrishna's life and teaching so much. And that's equally true of my first encounter with the Bhagavad Gita, because the Gita is full of bhakti, but I just kind of like overlooked it because it just didn't resonate with me at that time. Now, of course, I can see it's the most important aspect of the Gita, and in my own life, bhakti has taken on a kind of paramount role, but that took years of evolution, I would say, development for that to happen. And so instead, I remember, I think probably before I even read the life of Sri Ramakrishna, but that might not be true. I just don't remember. But Nikalanji's translation of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna actually has a substantial introduction where he summarizes Sri Ramakrishna's life and some of the key incidents in it. So I probably did read that. I don't know whether I read the actual Gospel before that or after that or in the middle. But in any case, I was sort of introduced to both, and I found them both really compelling. But a few things that I found most compelling, as I said, bhakti was not one of the things that immediately drew me, but one was his insistence on the need to renounce kamini kanchan. And there's a lot of controversy about how do we translate kamini kanchan. Kanchan is simple; it means gold, and he means it in the sense of greed in general. You have to overcome greed. Kamini, in a sort of basic way, is simple too, because it means you should also have to renounce lust. But it's significant, I think, that he doesn't use the word kama, which would be the standard word in Bengali and Sanskrit to translate lust. He uses kamini, which means not woman, as Nikalanji translates, but a specific kind of woman. Women seen as objects of lust, I think, would be my preferred translation, but it's so awkward to put that in English, kamini, that if I'm ever asked to retranslate or to update the standard Nikalananda translation of the gospel, I would err on the side of just leaving Kamini Kanchan untranslated. And I could read Bangla, by the way, because I had gone to Bengali school in Boston. My parents would take me on Sundays to learn Bengali, reading and writing. And so I started to read the original Bengali teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, while also looking side by side with the English translation. And I just remember being impressed with, number one, that the need to renounce lust and greed in order to make spiritual progress. I felt that was foundational, and it really resonated with me. As I said, as a kind of budding monk, I mean, and secondly, just the fact that on every page of the gospel, he's soaring into the heights of samadhi, spiritual transcendental experience, at the slightest provocation.
Yeah.
Song, but it could just be literally looking at somebody, hearing a word uttered, in a completely different context, and he would. And so that really impressed me. That's also what Swami Vivekananda said had impressed him. That religion to Sri Ramakrishna was not just a theory or a belief, but something that was deeply lived and felt in his day-to-day life. Yeah.
And how is that like? I mean, if you could speak on it, and if it's a personal one, then I completely understand. But like, how is that relationship with Sri Ramakrishna today as compared to when he appealed to you at first?
Yeah. So actually, I mean, the way I put it is, my philosophical worldview evolved maybe in 3 stages. One was the one I've initially alluded to, which is this kind of spiritually seeking agnostic phase. The second phase was kind of, I think, late in my PhD. I still couldn't stomach the personal God, and so, but I really love, especially after reading the complete works of Swami Vivekananda, I kind of read him as a follower of Shankara, the great 8th century champion of Advaita Vedanta, which holds that, well, the famous formula is Brahma Satyam Jagad Mithya Jivo Brahme Vinaparaha. Non-dual, pure consciousness, Nirguna Brahman alone is real, from the ultimate standpoint. And this world of names and forms is ultimately unreal, non-existent, and we in our deepest nature are one with that non-dual pure consciousness. We are that non-dual pure consciousness. So that was Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. I remember at the time interpreting Swami Vivekananda as a card-carrying kind of Shankarite. And I felt that Advaita Vedanta was a very rationally satisfying philosophical worldview, one that doesn't require the assumption of a theistic God, which at the time I felt was hard to digest. So that was I sort of fell head over heels for Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, and specifically Swami Vivekananda's kind of understanding of it. And then what happened was a combination of three things. This like the transition. So that first transition was from a spiritual seeking / agnosticism. Second phase was Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. I started moving away from it, and for a combination of reasons, these three reasons. I had joined the order at this point. I was at Vivekananda University. I was a professor. I was deeply studying the Gautamrita, the original Bengali Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, very carefully every day, poring over it, and finding that on every page, Sri Ramakrishna's teachings were conflicting with key teachings of Shankara's. So that was one thing that struck me. I was like, well, if Swami Vivekananda was a follower of Shankara, Sri Ramakrishna didn't seem to be. Not that Sri Ramakrishna didn't accept Shankara, but he accepted Shankara and Ramanuja and Madhva and Tantra and Christianity and Islam in a way that I think Shankara, that was just broader. And just to kind of pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna into the Shankara box seemed to be doing him an injustice and sort of doing violence to him and his thinking and his teachings. So that was one thing that I had trouble squaring. I couldn't square Sri Ramakrishna's teachings with Shankara's doctrine. Second was I was also deeply studying the Vedantic scriptures in the original Sanskrit, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, Brahma Sutra, and I was looking at Shankara's commentaries and finding again and again that at certain key places, when it came to bhakti, when it came to karma yoga, when it came to the ontological status of this world or the ontological status of the personal God, again and again, I found that he was what Swami Vivekananda used to call text torturing, and that I just was not convinced. And again, I mean, I'm really treating these. I was reading these scriptures as a scholar, as an academically trained philosopher, and literary critic. I also studied English in depth. And so I couldn't, in all honesty, even if I liked the philosophy of Shankara a lot, I mean, I loved it, but I couldn't square his philosophy with Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. I also couldn't square it with the original Vedantic scriptures in many places. And then the third factor was as a spiritual aspirant, I felt that while it's very easy to parrot the teachings of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, it's almost impossible for most people, including myself, to practice Advaita in a real way, in a way that doesn't amount to self-deception. And so it was the convergence of these three factors that kind of led me. I remember sort of at one point during my training center in Biluma that I just decided. At the same time, I was also studying even more carefully Sri Aurobindo's works. And he was deeply influenced by both Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda. And I'm planning on writing an entire book on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. It'll be the third installment in what I call my integral Advaita trilogy of books, because I wrote one published in 2018 by Oxford, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality. It's a philosophical study of Sri Ramakrishna. The book that was published last year by Oxford is called Swami Vivekananda's Vedanta Cosmopolitanism. It's a philosophical study of Swami Vivekananda. So to cap it off, I want to write a book on Sri Aurobindo's philosophy. And one of the main theses is that, or arguments, is that we should place Sri Aurobindo in the same spiritual lineage as Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, even if he doesn't agree with them on all points, but that you don't have to agree with someone on all points to belong to the same lineage, And so I'm excited about that book. I'm writing a book now, actually, on something completely different: karma and rebirth in Hinduism. But that could be a topic for later in the podcast. So wait, where was I? Oh yeah. So then, yeah, the third phase that I'm at now is moving away from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta as my basic philosophical worldview to what I call Vijnana Vedanta, which accepts Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, but is much broader than it because it equally accepts other philosophical traditions, other religions, in a way that I think Shankara's philosophy can't do.
No, that's all amazing, and I think I remember having long conversations with you about this a few years back, uh, and that again, I've probably said that to you then, and I'll say it again. It brought a lot of clarity for myself,
Mm.
on that path of seeking of,
Mm.
hey, which one of these schools works for me, because I love this one, but I don't
Right.
love it when it does this, and I love bhakti, but I don't fully agree with the conclusions here, and it definitely broadened my scope when I was able to read
Mm.
Sri Aurobindo as well as Sri Ramakrishna, and then also the lens that you provided at that time. Um, I want to jump right into that,
Mhm.
into those things that you touched upon, but I feel like, especially for the listeners as well, it will be important to kind of create a kind of a foundation, at least before we get into, say, Vijnana, and we get into
Mhm.
um, Sri Aurobindo as well. So I guess if we had to give a quick summary of Vedanta, what is Vedanta, and what are the, I guess, the schools in summary? It's a tough task here, but
Well, it's a huge. It's not that it's well, it is tough, but it's also huge. So
I know, I know, I know.
I gave a lecture on this topic called
I
Vedanta.
could see,
Yeah,
I could try it, but I would and put a voiceover at the end of this podcast
yeah.
with me explaining it. But I'd rather you do it than me.
Sure. Yeah, yeah. I gave a lecture a few months ago called Vedanta for Dummies, and I did exactly. Yeah, I did exactly what you were asking. But at the end, the Swami that introduced me, at the end, he came up to the podium and he said that was not for dummies. Both of the Swamis, Swami Vivekananda, I gave the lecture twice. So
Oh
once
right,
in
yeah.
People Canyon, once in San Diego. They were like, that was not for dummies. So I kind of thought it was basic, but it turned out not to be all that basic. But in a very brief summary, what I'd say is Vedanta has three basic meanings. And so we first have to distinguish the three senses of Vedanta. So the first meaning is just the Upanishads. That's the most fundamental meaning of the Vedanta. Because Vedanta means literally it's a combination of two words, Veda and Anta. Anta means end or culmination. So the Upanishads are the textual and philosophical and spiritual culmination of the Vedas. It's part of the Vedas. The Upanishads are part of the Vedas, but they're considered to be the culminating portion of the Vedas. And that's the primary meaning of Vedanta. Second meaning is slightly broader. It's the Prasthana Traya, which means the three scriptural pillars of Vedanta, which starts with Upanishads, but includes also the Bhagavad Gita and the Brahma Sutra. The third meaning of Vedanta, so you see how it gets confusing, because a lot of people use the term Vedanta, but often I find that they're not clear about what sense they're using it in. The third sense of Vedanta is it can refer to any one of the many philosophical schools of Vedanta. And one of the most common mistakes I find people make is to equate Vedanta with Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. And I think that's a serious mistake. It's deeply misleading. In terms of philosophical schools, there are many, and it really would just take me too far afield and take too much time to explain all the doctrines of the different schools. But in a very brief summary, what I'd say is there's Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, which, as I already mentioned, holds that the ultimate reality is nirguna or nirvishesha, which means devoid of all attributes. And so, a more positive way of putting the same thing is it's strictly non-dual pure consciousness, but it does not have ultimately Brahman is not the person of God and doesn't have the attributes of the person of God, not omniscient, not omnipotent, not the creator of this world, because there is no world even ultimately. Um, And then, so that's Shankara's view. But the majority of schools, the other schools of Vedanta, the majority, not all of the other ones, but most of the other ones, are what are called bhakti schools of Vedanta. And in fact, Swami Tapasanji has written an entire book called Bhakti Schools of Vedanta to kind of redress the imbalance in scholarship, in even popular thinking about Vedanta, that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta has a monopoly on Vedanta. He wrote an entire book explaining in detail the doctrines of the different Bhakti schools of Vedanta, including Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta, Madhva's, people like to call it, or tend to call it Dvaita Vedanta, the school of dualism, but that's not what he called it. And so I prefer to call it Madhva Vedanta, which just means the school of Madhva. But there's also Vallabha Shuddha Dvaita Vedanta, which means the pure non-dualism of Vallabha. And the list goes on. And I can't possibly go into all the details, but the basic idea, as I said, is that these are all bhakti schools, which means that they believe in the ultimate reality of the personal God, unlike Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta. Some of them also accept Nirguna Brahman. Especially Chaitanya's Achinta Bheda Veda school of Vedanta and Vallabha's school of Shuddhadvaita Vedanta, they accept the highest reality of Krishna, the personal God, but they say that Nirguna Brahman, which Shankara and his followers are so obsessed with, is also real. It's just a minor aspect of Krishna. It's the Tanubha or the Pratibha of Krishna himself. So there's still a hierarchy in place. And they also, these bhakti schools of Vedanta take the world to be real. And that's another fundamental difference between Shankara school and these bhakti schools. And what they claim is that the world is real, but is dependent for its existence on God, on the personal God. But just because it's dependent on God for its existence doesn't make it unreal. And so I can go on explaining. And there are also major differences in terms of spiritual practice, what the highest spiritual practice is. Lo and behold, you won't be surprised to learn that the Bhakti schools of Vedanta hold that Bhakti Yoga is the highest spiritual practice, the yoga of devotion toward a personal God. Whereas Shankara held that Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, is the highest spiritual path, and that Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga are not useless, but they're helpful for inferior spiritual aspirants to develop sufficient purity of mind to become eligible to practice the higher spiritual practice of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge. And then alone you can reach the highest goal, which is liberation.
I guess going into Sri Ramakrishna's as well as Swami Vivekananda's approach to Vedanta, right? And, just to give my context that I'm speaking about, right? Like there's definitely a time where we see, Vedanta schools being completely just disagreeing, completely or, almost fighting over it in a scholarly sense, not necessarily in a war sense. But here you have philosophers
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
bhaktas or devotees who are seeing all paths lead to one, right? And they're taking that core of maybe the Vedic culture, maybe what you might call Hinduism, as just a philosophy of, these are all different paths, right? Or as Sri Ramakrishna gives the example of the elephant and the blind men, you recognize different things or different qualities or different things that attract you to define an elephant, or in this case, define God. And but all those paths will get you at the end of the day to that ocean, or will get you to that elephant. Get to God is what I'm trying to say. And so, with that in mind, how does this philosophy or this approach to Vedanta also incorporate Islam, Christianity, Abrahamic religions, Buddhism? How do you also find that as a path to the same truth? When it's even more distinct, right? It's not even saying, you could say about the Vedanta schools, right? That they're all recognizing the Upanishads. They're all recognizing Krishna as God in some way, maybe not as ultimate reality, but in some reality, they're all recognizing the Gita, Upanishads, Veds as validity, as the ultimate
Mm-hmm.
truth. But you have other religions that are not saying that. You have other religions that are saying our God or no God, right? You're an idol worshiper, or you deserve to go to hell for your belief system. Without naming those religions, including all those religions, how are they also leading as paths to the same truth?
Sure. Yeah. No, that's a great question. I mean, I think maybe before I get to that question, I want to answer a prior question, which is how does Sri Ramakrishna reconcile the different apparently conflicting schools of Vedanta? So, with regard to the con- sort of conflicting traditional Vedantic schools, I think what Sri Ramakrishna does is harmonizes them on the basis of his own spiritual experiences, because he was famous for having practiced multiple religious and spiritual paths, and he practiced bhakti schools, bhakti traditions like Vaishnavism. He practiced tantra under Bhairavi Brahmani, who was his first guru. He obviously also practiced Advaita Vedanta under his guru Totapuri, a wandering monk who had come to visit him. Without knowing, actually, he didn't know of Sri Ramakrishna until after he'd met him, but yeah, it's all divine dispensation, right? And so he practiced Advaita Vedanta with Totapuri and many other paths. He also practiced Christianity and Islam. So actually, my answers to the two questions are linked in a way. And he realized the same God in different forms and aspects through all of these different spiritual and religious paths. And it was on that basis that he was able to say, to affirm with authority, that all the different schools of Vedanta capture true aspects of one and the same infinite divine. And that bhakti schools correspond to the personal aspect, the dynamic personal aspect of the infinite divine, while Shankara's school of Advaita Vedanta corresponds to the nirguna, impersonal, non dual aspect of the same infinite divine, but that they're both equally true. And in terms of spiritual practices, remember I was mentioning that among the traditional schools of Vedanta, there's a lot of dispute about which is the highest spiritual practice. Is it Jnana Yoga or is it Bhakti Yoga? And what Sri Ramakrishna does, and what Swami Vivekananda does as well, following Sri Ramakrishna, his guru, is to claim that all four of the yogas, the main yogas, Karma Yoga, the yoga of selfless action, Raja Yoga, the yoga of concentration and meditation, Jnana Yoga, the yoga of knowledge, the path of knowledge, and Karma Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, the yoga of devotion, the path of devotion toward a personal God. All of these are direct and independent paths to salvation, and there's no higher and lower. It's really a matter of temperament, which one you feel temperamentally drawn toward, and the ideal is to combine all of them to the best of your ability, because then you're sort of tapping into and cultivating different aspects of the human personality at the same time.
Adding other religions that may be contradictory or may reject us or may reject Vedanta, how are they also included in this? You know,
Right. Well, one thing I want to add, though, is that Madhva's school is pretty exclusivistic. So even within the Hindu fold, you get
right?
exclusivistic traditions. And Madhva, for instance, holds that there's an eternal hell. A lot of people don't know this because they only know, if they know Vedanta, they only seem to know about Shankara's school. But if you study the details of Madhva's philosophy, you'll find that he believed in eternal hell, and that some souls, some poor souls, are condemned to end up in that eternal hell. They're called tamo yogya, jivas which are destined for darkness, the darkness of eternal hell. And Madhva believe that there are two other categories of soul. One is nitya samsari. They're souls who are doomed eternally to transmigrate. They can't escape the cycle of rebirth. And it's only the highest category of soul, which he called mukti yogya, those who are able to attain liberation, who can ultimately go on to attain liberation. And so I hope anybody who's familiar with some of the Abrahamic religions, they might see parallels with the doctrine of an eternal hell. And so we don't even have to go step outside of Hinduism to discover a doctrine of eternal hell, and a really exclusivistic kind of attitude. So yeah, that's the first kind of qualification I would add, is that we don't need to step out of the Hindu fold to find exclusivism and those kinds of attitudes. And Shankara's school is broader, certainly much broader than a school like Madhva's, but at the same time is not broad enough, I think. It's what is called in philosophy, religion, and theology an inclusivist approach to non-Advaitic paths. Swami Tapasnisi put it really well. In fact, in the introduction to his book, Bhakti Schools of Vedanta, there's a section called The Patronizing Attitude of Advaita Vedanta. And he takes the metaphor of Mount Everest and he says, really what Advaitins are doing is they're making this inclusivist move. It's inclusivist in a bad sense. It's a kind of a negative sense in the philosophical sense. Advaitins are the ones standing at the peak of Mount Everest, and they look down from the dizzying heights, and they see these bhaktas down there. They could barely see them, but because they're at the base camp, and they tell these bhaktas, "You guys are good too. You're on the way to our, to us where we are at the peak. You're not wrong. You're not hopeless, but you're certainly lower than us. And it's because you're inferior aspirants that you're practicing these non-Advaitic paths. Maybe if you're lucky after many, many births, you'll come up to the point where you're eligible. You have a sufficiently pure mind to practice the path of knowledge, and then alone can you join us at these heights." And so I think Shankara's school is also inclusivist in a problematic way, in that it's not sufficiently broad. And so within the Hindu fold, I think that there's a lot of diversity, and I think that's important to emphasize. Some people think that all of Hinduism is extremely broad and liberal. I just don't think that's true. I think that most, like, everyday Hindus are very broad, or many of them. But most of them also don't know much about their all these philosophical traditions, and so that gets complicated. Exactly what their beliefs are, I think some of them might even be hard pressed to explain what they are, what they actually believe, in a deeper, more precise or rigorous way. Yeah. Okay, so that was the first qualification. But now coming back to the question which you asked me 10 minutes ago, which is, how did Sri Ramakrishna harmonize non-Hindu religions along with the Hindu religion? I think it's simple once you understand, because it's the same logic that he used to harmonize the different schools of Vedanta. Because, for instance, what do the Abrahamic religions teach? Christianity, Islam, Judaism, they believe in a personal God. That's uncontroversial. And so he says, wonderful. Just as the Bhakti schools of Vedanta and Vaishnavism and Tantra, they believe in a personal God. Christianity and Islam also believe in a personal God. And I myself practice. I'm ventriloquizing Sri Ramakrishna here. Sri Ramakrishna actually practiced Christianity. He practiced Islam, and he found that they also are effective paths to the goal of God realization. And he realized through these paths God in the form of Christ and God in the form of Allah. And in the gospel, if you're interested in Buddhism, that's actually a more complicated question in different ways, because it's a non-theistic spiritual philosophy. But what he says in the gospel is Buddha was not an atheist. He realized his true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, but he couldn't put that experience in words. Mm-hmm. And he chose not to put it in a positive way, in the way that Advaita Vedantins do. But he says basically he had the same realization as Advaita Vedantins did. That's the short answer. And so Advaita Vedanta, Buddhism, they correspond, these religious paths correspond to the impersonal aspect of the same infinite divine. That theistic traditions, that bhakti traditions, are also, their understanding of God is just corresponding to the saguna, or personal aspect of the same infinite divine.
Right.
And so he would use the example of an infinite ocean. He would say that the infinite ocean is Satchitananda. It's the ultimate reality. God, the infinite divine. In certain places, under the cooling influence of bhakti, of devotion for the personal God, that infinite ocean congeals into formations of ice. And each one is different. There's one ice formation, obviously, he's thinking of different forms of the personal God. So one could be Christ, one could be Krishna, one could be Ganesha, and so on and so forth. And then his story, the parable continues. He says, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, Jnana Surya, Gyan Shurja in Bangla, the forms of ice melt. And if you stop there, Advaita Vedantins in Shankara's school would feel vindicated. Because then they say, see, but with the rising of the sun of knowledge, these forms of the personal God melt. So, there's just the infinite ocean. That's just our non-dual pure consciousness, after all. But his parable continues one step further, which a step that Shankarites would not dare to make, which is, Sri Ramakrishna says, but in some places the ice doesn't melt at all. it turns into quartz, he says. And he says these are the eternal forms of God. And he specifically refers to, for instance, Nitya Krishna Nitya Bhakta in Bengali, which means there's Nitya Krishna, the eternal Krishna, and there are also his eternal bhaktas. And ultimately, we have to kind of link this to his picture, his very expansive view of salvation. What does salvation look like after? Let's assume I attain liberation in this life. What happens after I leave the physical body? And what Sri Ramakrishna says is that there are two fundamentally different paradigms of salvation, both of which are equally true. One is what he referred to metaphorically as eating sugar, and the other is what he referred to as becoming sugar. The eating sugar paradigm is the goal of Abrahamic religions, an idea of an eternal heaven in which you dwell with the personal God, whom you lovingly worship and you lovingly serve. And of course, we have the equivalent of that in Hindu bhakti traditions as well. We have different lokas, these different eternal realms, transcendental realms. One is the Vishnu loka, where you're with Vishnu. Another one is the Goloka, where you're with Krishna, and so on and so forth. But then there's also this fundamentally different eating sugar, becoming sugar paradigm, which means there's no coming and going. There's no staying in an eternal heaven. There's just resting in your true nature as pure consciousness, as non-dual pure consciousness. So he says that's the goal of Advaita Vedantins and some Buddhists. But both are equally true. And I think his reasoning is, why can't salvation be like a many-roomed mansion? And depending on your temperament, depending on your spiritual practices, what you did, and what form of God you worship, you can choose which room to inhabit. It could be the Christian room, the Christian form of salvation, or the Islamic room, or the Vaishnava room, or the Advaita Vedanta room, or the Buddhist room. But there's nothing contradictory about one person being in one room and another person inhabiting a different room of the same mansion.
Getting to that topic a bit deeper now, even though we've gotten pretty deep. One thing I remember when I came across this as well, and was reading up on it, especially in terms of, say, Sri Aurobindo's perspective on it and his integral Vedanta or integral yoga lens on it, which is just it's a difficult thing to read, especially as English. But when it comes to that, one thing that is interesting is how do you prove that, sort of, this is true as well as this could be true, right? In the world, or in the realm of Brahman, or in the realm of the ultimate truth. How do you prove that with the Upanishads, the Gita as the basis? How are you able to do that? And because in a sense you are kind of creating another school. I don't know if that's fair to say. But
I think so. I can call it a new harmonizing school of Vedanta.
A new harmonizing school. So, for those who don't know, in any sort of, tradition, especially, maybe it's a more Eastern thing to do, less maybe an Abrahamic thing to do. If you are to create a new school of thinking, you have to debate it, you have to prove it, and you have to accept, which is kind of a beautiful thing that maybe not many people know about, say, Hindu culture or just Indian culture in general, why there were, you don't really see, at least during those times, in the ancient times, war occurring on the basis of, say, different ideologies, was because there was more of a openness to conversation. And yeah, you may be wrong, but let's debate it. Or, hey, here's, you look at the Brahma Sutras, let's look at the Buddhist lens, let's look at the Sankhya thing, and then I'm going to defend my school. I'm going to defend what I believe. So how do you, I guess, my question to you is, how do you defend, I'm sure you can write papers on this, but how do you defend Vijnana Vedanta using scripture?
Right. Okay. Great question. I mean, again, just a qualification before that, because of something you said. I mean, I do think that you'll find the equivalent of really intense debates about scripture and how best to interpret scripture in the Abrahamic traditions.
Oh, you can. Okay.
You find very, very deep debates in Islamic theology, but also in Christian theology. And Martin Luther was a great scholar and produced brilliant commentaries on the Bible and very new interpretations, which conflicted with, and he argued against the Catholic interpretation. of the
Right.
scriptures, and so so I don't think that that's absent from
Okay. Yeah.
Hindu
Sorry, I
tradition,
didn't mean
right?
to mean that.
I
Yeah.
don't think that would be fair to say. But now coming to your question, so Vijnana Vedanta. One is, let's take for instance Bhagavad Gita. You'll find that there are a number of verses, shlokas in the Bhagavad Gita, which seem to suggest that the ultimate spiritual goal is a dhamma. So, for instance, there's a place where Krishna refers to tad dhamma paramam mama. That dhamma, that abode, is my supreme one, is my supreme abode. So that seems to, dhamma really suggests a kind of eternal abode in which one dwells. And there are other expressions like that in the Bhagavad Gita, which seem to support the ideal of bhakti schools, the eating sugar kind of paradigm. But the same scripture also talks in certain places of becoming Brahman, literally, Brahma Bhutaha, which literally means becoming Brahman, having become Brahman.
Yeah.
And that can lend itself to more of a kind of Advaitic um, becoming sugar kind of paradigm of salvation. And both seem to be affirmed by Bhagavan Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita. And he's not saying that one alone is ultimately true and not the other. But he seems to affirm both salvific ideals, both ideals of salvation is equally true. And so that's one example. And then there are other examples that one can give from the Upanishads, for instance, in the Kathopanishad, Tat Vishnov Paramam Padam. There's a reference to the supreme abode of Vishnu, a kind of surprising reference in the Upanishads, because you don't normally find very explicit references to the personal God. You find references to the personal God in many places, but to an abode of the personal God like this, it's very
Yeah.
strange. So the abode of Vishnu, the supreme abode of Vishnu, it's right there. But the Upanishads also talk constantly of becoming one with Brahman. And how just as water, if you pour water with water, the two streams of water merge together, and that's a kind of more of an Advaitic ideal of salvation. You find that in other Upanishads as well. And so I think that if you study the Upanishads and Bhagavad Gita, especially, you find that there are actually, if you want to throw in the Brahma Sutra, there's a lot of controversy about its conception of the ultimate goal, but it talks about Brahma Loka as the highest goal in certain sutras, and Brahma Loka suggests again a loka, a transcendental realm in which you can dwell with Brahman, and so that arguably supports more of the kind of bhakti ideal of salvation. But it's complicated. I mean, this requires a lot of kind of deep scriptural study and exegesis, and that's something that I would like eventually to produce 3 books, God willing, like a Prasthanatraya Bhashya from the standpoint of Vijnana Vedanta. And so one book, a new commentary on the Bhagavad Gita, second would be a new commentary on some of the main Upanishads, and the third would be a new commentary on the Brahma Sutra from the standpoint of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition of Vijnana Vedanta.
Yeah. I mean, side note, I remember you telling me that as like sort of a vision you had to try to accomplish, a few years back when we spoke, which would be amazing. I remember you referred to, I believe it was the Swaminarayans. You said that they had done
Yeah,
something similar, and you were,
absolutely, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, they've already done it, and
yeah,
we have yet to do it. And
yeah,
somebody should. Let's see whether
yeah.
that person is me or not. Yeah.
Um, I guess let's get out of a little bit of that deep, deep end of stuff, and I think this is kind of relevant to um, the book you were kind of mentioning. At least I would believe it is because it's named Karma. And that, kind of speaking more in the lens of a youth, maybe a seeker. Um, and I want to kind of push this, notify this in terms of what, the podcast is trying to do, is allow the listener to be the host at the same time, allow them to feel as if we are asking the questions that are common to any seeker. Which is, I guess, karma plays a big role in that, right? And what I mean by that is, even if you don't believe in karma, it's trying to make sense of free will, right? A common struggle, maybe in terms of even leading to some mental health struggles that people have, is not knowing to what extent do I control my destiny, and to what extent do I let it go, right? let go of the expectations of it. And I guess karma yoga comes to a play here where it tells you, karma yoga tells you to let go of the fruits of the action, let go of the attachment, and act and work and fight the way Arjun did, in a sense, on the battlefield after the Gita was heard. Um, I guess my question to you is, in that process of letting go of the fruits, right? Letting go of something that's temporary, letting go of attachment and desire. Um, what does it mean to detach? What is, I think the word in Sanskrit could be vairagya. Um, what does that actually mean? Because to a certain extent, what's the struggle is you are indulging in action. You want to work
Mhm.
hard,
Mhm.
but in the process of that, how do you not attach? What does it mean to not attach?
Yeah, no, I get this question a lot because I teach a class in the Bhagavad Gita at USC. I'm a Hindu chaplain at University of Southern California and also UCLA. And so I teach this regular class on Gita, and I get this question where a lot of young people ask me, well, karma yoga, I get it in principle, but the problem is the moment I stop seeking the fruits of my actions, I'm going to lose motivation to do those actions in the first place. And I'll just be like a mediocre actor or something, a mediocre worker. Is that really the goal that Bhagavad Gita is preaching? And my answer is no. And I think there's good evidence for this, that Bhagavan Krishna in chapter 18, he says, he describes the characteristics of a sattvika actor, which is a kind of a very good actor, an ideal actor. And he says, Mukta Sangaha Anahamvadi Dhriti Utsaha Smanvitaha Siddha Siddhyo Nirvikaraha Katta Satvika Uchyate. First attribute, free from all attachments to the fruits of work, but also free from attachment to the work itself. That's another kind of attachment, which is
Yeah.
you might just like be so attached to the work you're doing that if you're suddenly forced into a circumstance where you can't do that work anymore, you become miserable. That's another form of attachment which has to be renounced. But so mukta sango means being free from either attachment to the work itself and also attachment to the fruits of the work. Anahamvadi, completely free from egoism about the work, like I'm so great because I'm doing this or have done this, or that kind of ahankara, that feeling of egoism. Dhriti utsaha samanvitaha, but at the same time, full of enthusiasm for the work and perseverance. Dhriti means perseverance and utsaha means enthusiasm. Should be full of enthusiasm and vigor and perseverance in doing the work. You don't want to do something halfway and just say I'm bored or I'm tired. Let me give it up halfway. No. And then finally, this is the key. The next phrase: Siddha siddhyo nirvikaraha kattasat kuchate. Being equal in success and failure. And so, to me, what renouncing the fruits of action means, at least primarily, is whether you succeed or fail in your endeavor. That's what you need to renounce your attachment to. So if you're a surgeon, you're going to perform that surgery to the best of your ability, but whether the patient lives or dies, that's not in your hands. You leave that up to God. And if the patient dies in spite of your best efforts, you shouldn't become terribly depressed about it, because you did your best. And because ultimately success or failure is up to God. That's not in your hands. That's just a simple example, but does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. It's another thing that I've kind of experienced. Someone actually asked me this. A friend actually asked me this, and it was definitely an interesting question, where along the lines of karma, where in one sense you say, let go of the fruits, or we say let go of the fruits, but it's also letting go of the desire, right? And I'm speaking in a sense of like, what's happening mentally, or what may be explained um, by, I guess, Hindu tradition, or I guess yoga tradition as well, where you have imprints, right? You have some skaras that are created, and that's in a sense why you are alive, right? You are alive because of what's called vasanas. These are just, I know to a listener, these are just might be just completely new words. But the idea being that I am alive because I have to burn certain karma, and I'm also creating new karma as a result. And I want to be free. In the Gita, you hear a lot of being free from action as well, being free from desire in a sense. So, how does karma yoga lead to that freedom?
Yeah. So through the elimination of egoism and desire, because it's really the desire for the fruits of our actions and desire for worldly pleasures that's ultimately resulting in more and more karma that's keeping us in this world, making us be reborn again and again and assume new bodies. And so through karma yoga, we become less and less selfish. We gradually attenuate our worldly desires and thereby come closer to exhausting our karma, which keeps us in the cycle of rebirth. I mean, that's the short answer.
I guess coming to the other end of it, where um, I'd love to talk about sort of Vedant in practice, right? And we kind of touched on it with Karma Yoga a little bit, allowing us to see the practical understandings and how to get clarity on expectations and attachment. But what would be your tips or your advice to, a youth or a seeker who sees the philosophy of Vedanta and its acceptance and its whichever school it may be, but they're convinced of it intellectually, but they're wondering, how do I practice this? What would be your advice to that?
In the case of our tradition, what our the standard answer would be, I think the best answer is the first step in your spiritual life is to engage in what might be called brutally honest self-assessment. Brutally honest self-assessment. I add that qualifier, that brutally honest, because many of us think that we understand ourselves very well, but I don't think it's sufficiently brutally honest. Warts and all, weaknesses and all, we should really just make an assessment from the beginning and just say, like, these are my strengths as far as I can tell. These are my liabilities and weaknesses, and these are things that I need to improve in my spiritual life. And once you do that, you start figuring out, well, wait a minute. So I have these strengths. Let me try to tap into those strengths by engaging in spiritual practices that make best use of those strengths. So for instance, if I'm a very active person and I like helping other people, then karma yoga could be a really great path for that person. If I have a kind of innately devotional temperament, then hey, bhakti yoga could be the path for me, or the kind of primary path, because I don't want to. In our tradition, the four yogas are not mutually exclusive, and so, but you can take one as primary or central, and the others. So one is kind of the nucleus, and the others as kind of electrons are revolving around them,
Yeah.
subordinate to the main one, but still practiced in unison. And so I would encourage youth to try to, first of all, engage in this brutally honest self-assessment, which is not always pleasant. It's rarely pleasant. Sometimes it's pleasant, but there's an unpleasant side to it as well, because you have to acknowledge your own weaknesses and limitations. Secondly, on the basis of that brutally honest self-assessment, you ask yourself which yoga or yogas kind of best suit me and will help me to cultivate my strengths and optimally. And so there's no one size fits all answer to that, but that ultimately one should strive to combine the yogas to the best of one's ability, because each of them taps into a different aspect of the human personality. And so the most potent practice is the one that combines the kind of forces of these different spiritual practices.
I think obviously I could go on, and I'd love to go on and on, but just to summarize a little bit, where we sort of the journey that we were hoping to go for is kind of understanding your journey, trying to relate to that maybe a little bit for any of us, to getting to more of the deep philosophical understandings of your basis of Sri Ramakrishna, as well as what Vedanta means to you, as well as what is, um, the different schools and the different ideas and traditions, but what unifies at the core of Vijnana Vedanta. And then also ultimately through Karma Yoga and through understanding the practice of it and the struggles maybe a youth or a seeker goes through, understanding how it relates back to us. And I want to cap that off with our theme here, being the philosophy of now, and redefining that here, where we define the philosophy of now is as a life mantra that one could meditate upon, or one is mindful of, not necessarily in their past or not necessarily in their future, but in every present moment, in that now that we try to be present in when maybe we're meditating or when we're acting. Hopefully meditation is not just a close your eyes process, but an active process in our daily life. And so learning from people like you as well, what that might be. So what, I guess, is your philosophy of now?
One of them would be, this is a kind of, I think many Indians who were raised in India are familiar with this, but man proposes, God disposes. And of course, it's gendered, so we can change it to, but it's snappier that way. But obviously, the point is, human beings propose things but God ultimately disposes, which means what? So you can kind of catch yourself in the act when you're asking before about how do you know when you're making progress and sort of when you're getting attached. But this is another test is, when you like, you're a journalist and I'm an academic. I'm an academic philosopher, and I submit things for publication in journals and publish books. And you can test yourself and ask yourself to what extent I'm getting attached to the fruits of what I'm doing. How much desire do I have to publish in X, Y, or Z prestigious journal or prestigious book publisher? There are ways to kind of check yourself. And one of the things that I find very helpful is right before and right after, and sometimes in the midst of the work that I'm doing, whether it's writing an article or a book, I offer what I've done to God as a way of kind of divesting myself of any of those kind of lingering ambitions or desires, or trying to, right? I mean, it's not a all or nothing process, as I said. So this is a gradual process, but it's a gradual evolution. But those kinds of things where you remind yourself that at the end of the day, no matter how hard I work, the results are up to God. Man proposes, God disposes. So that helps me a lot in a very concrete way.
No, that's amazing. Again, going off that, I reminds me of our previous conversations. And I think it was before, also, yeah, it was before you had you were a Swami. And it was during that time I spoke a lot about trying to use my efficiency and trying to see how my craft or my art or my efficiency could be used or could be spiritualized.
Mm-hmm.
Could be as a means for devotion. And sort of the tradition that I do come from, our guru speaks about using that efficiency for as a means, what we call kruti bhakti, action oriented devotion. um, and looking at what you were doing and what you continue to do is, I think, and speak about, is certainly an inspiration for so many of us, include especially myself, in seeing that, oh, it is possible, and it's a tough process of
Mm-hmm.
what you said at the end, where I think, which is so important. It's like you're giving it to God, but it's still an attempt, right? Because you have to make an active effort, right?
Absolutely, yeah. No,
Yeah.
and one other thing I'd say is in this context, I think one of the best source texts for this kind of spiritual practice is the Bhagavad Gita, because it talks again and again of what Bhagavan Krishna calls swadharma, our own law of being, what makes us tick in particular. And we should do the work that is swabhava niyatam, in accordance with our swabhava, in accordance with our own law of being. And only recently have positive psychologists begun to recognize the importance of this Gita's concept of swadharma. I'm thinking in particular of the work of Martin Seligman. Have you heard of him? He's one of the pioneer kind of positive psychologists. He wrote a book called Authentic Happiness. And the basic premise is, first step, it's like my brutally honest self-assessment step. He says you do the same thing and figure out what your strengths are, what your most fundamental character strengths are. And on that basis, you should decide your career and what your calling is. Because if you're able to do that, um, your work will be more fulfilling. You'll achieve what he calls authentic happiness, and the work will be better, and you'll be benefiting society even more than you would have otherwise. And I think that you can find that idea in the Bhagavad Gita millennia before Martin Seligman wrote that book just recently. Mm-hmm.
Beautiful. Thanks so much again, Swamiji, for
Thanks a
this.
lot,
This
Keshav.
was
It was a lot of
beautiful.
fun. Thanks for the
Yeah,
wonderful questions.